You're listening to Forward, a podcast from faculty at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, hosted by Michelle Knight, Josh Jipp, Madison Pierce, and James Arcadi. Forward invites listeners into the mission of Trinity Evangelical Divinity School through conversations with faculty, staff, and guests.
Hey James, how's it going?
Hey Madison, pretty well. How are you?
Yeah, doing well. We just got back from spring break and we're looking forward to Easter, so it's been a good time. I noticed that I think while we were away for spring break that you had another book come out.
Yeah, I had I co-edited a book. I'm going to hold it up here for those who are on video, those who are on audio. I am currently holding up a book that I co-edited with Dr. J.T. Turner of Anderson University. This is the T&T Clark Handbook to Analytic Theology. If you're on audio only, I'm sorry. I love the cover. It was a friend of mine from Gordon and a parishioner of mine, Tanya Butler, who designed the image there that we got to use. But yeah, the T&T Clark Handbook of Analytic Theology. I'm stoked.
That's very cool. Yeah, so there's a lot of excitement in the Arcadi household.
Yeah, in fact, so I brought this home the other day and I brought it out of my bag to just like show my kids who don't care all that much. But I was showing my wife and she was like kneeling on the ground playing with my kids, whatever. And she was looking through it and my dog, walks up kind of nonchalantly and then just bites the book, just like a big old chaw. And I like grabbed it out of his mouth and thankfully there weren't any like chew marks or anything on there. But I was like, man's best friend. He just coming over here? I don't know. Maybe it's his love language, just biting things. I'm not sure, but I was kind of shocked. I didn't anticipate that kind of review. I guess not yet.
Is that pretty atypical behavior? Does he go around biting books all the time?
He loves to eat, and he's so hopeful that almost anything is food. So it's not totally out of character. So it's not vicious. It's just like he's a great big nose and a stomach, and so just about anything is kind of tested as like, is this food? Is this food? Because if it is, I'm going to eat it. And I think he found out that this book is food for the mind, not for the dog's stomach.
Womp womp. That's awesome. Yeah, I think there have been a couple of times where Isabel our dog has acted in a really atypical way where it's so atypical that it's really hard for it not to be offensive. I can't think of a good example, but it's like, she never has bitten anything, but she just like, or has an accident, but then she like goes to the bathroom on my shoe or something like that. And it's like, how in the world would I not take that personally? But
I don't like these shoes. That's what she's saying, huh?
Yeah. Okay, great. Thanks, Isabel. Well, James, we've got Steve Roy coming to join us today. So we'll be talking about pastoral theology and worship. And I think y'all are going to get to geek out about systematics a little bit.
Yeah, a little bit. And he's a Gordon Conwell grad, just like yours truly.
Right. Yeah, I think he even loves Southern California. So you've got a lot in common.
He does. It's a good thing to love. No, we're glad he's here at TEDS. He's got his PhD from TEDS and been teaching here at TEDS for a long time too. And so, yeah, I'm looking forward to chatting with him.
Yeah, me too. Let's go see Steve. Welcome to Forward, a TEDS faculty podcast. I'm Madison Pierce.
And I'm James Arcadi.
Today, we have the absolute pleasure of interviewing Dr. Stephen C. Roy. Dr. Roy is Associate Professor of Pastoral Theology and the Chair of the Pastoral Theology Department here at TEDS. He completed his PhD in Systematic Theology at TEDS, and prior to that, he completed his MDiv at Gordon Conwell and a Bachelor of Arts at Stanford University. Steve, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Madison. James, it's great to be with you.
Yeah, well, thanks so much, Steve. It's good to have you here on the program and looking forward to chatting with you. I thought I might just start off asking a bit about how it is you came to TEDS. I think you've been on the faculty since, 1998 or so? So it's quite a while. And so just sort of curious about what brought you to TEDS and what kind of experiences you have prior to coming to TEDS that you're even still kind of bringing into your teaching experience now.
Yeah, thanks, James. Prior to coming to TEDS, I was a pastor. I was an associate pastor for 5 years in Minneapolis, 7 years as a senior pastor in Portland, Oregon. And I sought to be a theological pastor, combining a love for theology and the ministry of the church. Through a series of circumstances, the Lord made it clear that our time at Portland was coming to an end, and a good friend who was on the faculty at TED said, why don't you think about some more study? And so I came here for PhD work in systematics, and then still sought to combine those loves for theology and the church, not so much as a theological pastor, but as a pastoral theologian. And that's been the past 23 and a half years.
I love that. Thank you, Steve. And we'll circle back around, because I think that integration of theology, or systematic theology, and pastoral theology is really important to you. But for now, since we are talking about some of your experiences, having read What God Thinks When We Fail, I know that book, at least you acknowledge that it comes out of some of your experiences as well. Could you tell us a little bit about that project? And then, 10 years later, do you have a kind of enduring or new word for listeners about success and failure?
Yeah, that's been an important part of my journey, both personally and professionally. So this book on failure really did come out of our pastoral experience in Portland. Many times, as things didn't always go exactly the way I'd hoped for or dreamed for, I struggled with feelings of failure. Mm. And I came to realize it was not so much an actual failure as more just distorted understandings of success and failure, derived largely from broader American culture, and in particular, the American evangelical subculture. So I needed to be reprogrammed as to what God thinks when we fail, because we all will, one way or another, one time or another, and how to deal with that, both theologically and emotionally. And actually, I found in my own life, it's the latter that's a bit more difficult. Mm. So it began a process in our time in Portland, and preaching and teaching on that, as well as then the process of writing. And I teach on this regularly, and have done retreats and different kinds of things. It's not just for people in ministry. It's people across the board in our churches. We struggle with issues. What does it mean to be successful? What happens when we fail? And it's been an ongoing process, and it still is going to this day.
Mm. Yeah, thank you.
I don't know if I can just follow up on that, Steve, just briefly maybe. I wonder if you could help me kind of like juxtapose those two kind of conceptions of success and failure, that which you sort of see in a American culture or evangelical subculture versus what you were sort of seeing as a more, biblically grounded understanding of success and failure.
Yeah, I spent quite a bit of time in the book trying to unpack sort of typical American views of success. You might define it very simply as success is what's bigger and better. Successful careers lead to bigger salaries. Successful actors and actresses have bigger box office stars. Successful athletes, their teams win more games and they have better statistics. And successful pastors lead bigger churches. Mm. We sometimes will say better, but that's a little bit too fuzzy. So oftentimes we just leave that out. We Americans tend to be pragmatic. We like to look at bottom lines, and successful bottom lines are bigger than non-successful ones. And that bleeds over into the church all the time. And I realized that I had absorbed much more of that than I even consciously knew. And I had to come to deal with that God is far more concerned with faithfulness and than he is with what's bigger. And what's better oftentimes gets mixed in with that bigger component. I needed to be reprogrammed, as well as to understand that some of what I might perceive to be failure may not be failure at all. It's not always sinful. If it is sinful, God forgives, and God is able and promises to use even our failures to build his eternal future, so failure is never the last word in our lives as Christians.
Yeah, thank you so much.
That's really helpful.
Yeah, that's a beautiful picture. I think you're right that we have a lot of work to do to kind of almost redeem failure and to recategorize what we label as failure, but then also to acknowledge the formative role that it might have. So thank you for your work. James, I'm going to kick it back to you. I know you just asked the follow-up, but I think you have some important questions about systematic theology, and you're the expert.
I don't know about that, but I mean, as someone who teaches systematic theology, but personally, I mean, I think like yourself, have a real sort of like interest in bringing theology to the church and kind of blurring that line maybe between systematic theology and practical theology or academic theology and what happens like in the church. So, you mentioned coming to TEDS to do your PhD in systematic theology, and you taught in that for a while. But then you moved into practical theology and are the chair of the pastoral theology department at TEDS. And I was kind of curious as how you sort of see that intersection. Like what led you first into systematic theology, and then what maybe led you into the pastoral theology department?
Well, I had a great love for theology, always have, since my MDiv studies and even before that, and loved the comprehensive, systematic approach. My sense has always been that when I get in trouble, when I see trouble in the church, it's because we don't always have a full picture. We latch on to one part of our theology, one part of Scripture, not try to integrate it with the whole. So I was really drawn to that. But I was also drawn to that for the sake of the church. There was enough of the pastor in me. I started doctoral studies in my 40s, which is very different than many people do. And in many ways, I felt that helped me because it guarded me against certain rabbit trails that are easy to go down and all that sort of thing. And I came up with this sense that I'm very passionate about of this important intersection between systematic theology, and it's biblical theology, it's historical theology too, but the life of the church. And I regularly tell students that the best ministry is done theologically, when you not only know what you're doing, but why. But it's equally the case that the best theology is done with a ministry mindset. And sometimes the traditional sense is that, you do your biblical studies, you do your theology, and then you think about how to apply it. Yeah. As if that influences one direction only. And I'm convinced it's got to be two directions. I think the church has to inform the academy, even as the academy informs the church. We need dialogue. We need to learn in both directions. I've oftentimes thought that it is the stories, the experiences of people in the pews that need to inform how it is we do our theology. So I'm very committed in my teaching and all my thinking, my own worship to bring those two worlds together.
Yeah. I think that's really helpful, Steve. Yeah.
I mean, James, you're a priest. You're so active in the church and all that. I know we're compatriots in this.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Thanks.
I think a lot of times when, and some of this is the fault of the professor, and I'm gesturing towards myself for those of you that are at home and cannot see or just listening. But, a lot of times students, as we're doing exegesis, they say, how does this connect to me? What are the practical implications? And I think you are pressing those boundaries a little bit, because when we are talking about who God is, who Jesus is, and all these other theological categories, that has profound connection with the way that we minister. So could you say a little bit more, Steve, about what it means to minister theologically? I think that's the phrase you used, but please correct me if I mess that up.
Well, for example, I spent a lot of time in the field of ecclesiology, and the nature of the church profoundly impacts leadership within the church. I would tell my students, for example, a general principle that across the board, it's the nature of the institution you're trying to lead determines the nature and the functions of leadership. That's true if you're trying to lead a family. It's true if you're trying to lead a corporation. It's true if you're trying to lead a church. That's why there's not a direct one-to-one correlation between Fortune 500 company CEOs and pastors of churches. It's not that there isn't anything we can learn from our brothers and sisters in the business world, But the church is fundamentally different. And so we need to know the church. Who are we as the church? That has to inform how we engage in leadership. Another example is the Doctrine of the Trinity. That's one of the things that I've spent a lot of time thinking about. How is it? I mean, Jesus prayed in John 17 that his followers would be one just as he was one with the Father and the Father with him. So what is it about the Trinity that it can help us understand both unity and diversity within the body of Christ? How is it that the relationships of triune persons help to inform the way we should relate to one another? How does it inform equality? How does it inform mutual honor? How does it inform the way that we do that? I'm convinced that the Doctrine of Trinity, for example, is huge in the way we think about ministry and how we view ministry, how we view worship.
That's great.
Couple of times.
That's great. Yeah, thanks so much for that reflection on that. And again, I as a systematician, I say amen. I think these are great things to bring together, and I'm so glad this is something that's been a real hallmark of your teaching here over the years. Maybe also kind of a more in more specificity, I understand you've been doing some work on the kind of the role of lament or the theological significance of lament, but so both theologically, but then also how to do that in the church as one of these intersection points between a theological concept and like a practical outflow within the church. I wonder if you could kind of share a bit of what you've been reflecting on with respect to the role of lament in worship and in the life of a church.
Yeah, thanks, James. That is a topic I'm very, very interested in. I do a lot of teaching in the area of worship, as well as my own worship personally and corporately. And one of the things that I have felt for a long time about much of evangelical worship is that the term I use, it's emotionally monotone, that it tends to be focused on celebration and victory at the expense of other emotions. Clearly, lament is a crucial part of that, but even other emotions of contentment, which tends to be more perhaps quiet than boisterous, exuberant celebration. Now, in the Psalms, there's plenty of celebration, but as we know, there are more lament psalms than there are celebration psalms. We don't do that. We don't do that well. And I'll tell you a story. I remember in a former church that we were a part of, I was teaching an adult Sunday school class, and there was a young couple in our class, and they had a 2-year-old son. It was a horrible situation, had liver cancer, and he was dying. And we as a class rallied around this couple, and they really felt our support. But then we would leave our class and go upstairs to worship. And it was one of these emotionally monotone seasons in the life of that church. And every song was to clap. Remember my wife, Susan, said, I don't think that our friends have much to relate to here. And it wasn't all that long before they stopped attending worship. They'd still come to Sunday school. It just didn't connect. Well, that's true at a personal level. We've had some tragedy in our own family, and our daughter, who survived a really significant tragedy, found that the church was a hard place because couldn't connect with this tone of celebration all the time. Well, it's not just in our personal lives, it's also in our corporate lives. I don't know how we can think about what's happening in the lives of our country, whether it's a pandemic, whether it's racial reckoning following George Floyd, whether it's the Atlanta shootings and Asian American violence against them, or the Boulder shootings. How can we not lament? Now, I think with lament, one of the things that I've tried to say is that it requires emotional engagement. We can't really stand in solidarity with others until we're engaged at deep levels that are emotional, brokenheartedly emotional. But then we have to engage in the questions of the psalmist, the agonizing questions. How long, O Lord? We have to be able to be brutally honest and name what's going on, to ask those questions, but it takes a bold faith to ask that, knowing that as we ask, God will in turn ask us to rise up and be answers to many of those questions as well.
Yeah, that's so helpful, Steve. And I think you're right that it's finding that balance. I've had similar experiences. My personality lends itself to a bit of lament and melancholy. I often feel comfortable in those spaces more than others sometimes. But I'm thankful this is another way that God allows us to balance one another, because I'm thankful for my sisters and brothers who kind of push me to more jubilant expressions, even in my grief and difficulty. But I think you're right that as a whole, the church could hurt better, especially with those around us.
Yeah, and we don't always have a lot of resources available to us to help us. There are a lot of songs of celebration. There aren't as many songs of lament. Liturgies of lament are beginning to be written more fully, and tragically, it's the circumstances that force us there. But it's harder for worship planners, worship leaders to come up with some of those resources to help us. And I think that's a growth edge for the church. And I think we're making some progress in that, but we need to be able to lament. Today, as we're meeting, has been the day of prayer on the Trinity campus, and in our prayer gathering this morning, there was significant seasons of lament, and I think that was very helpful for this. What we're going through as a country right now, as a church right now, as well as in so many lives.
Yeah, that's right. Steve, I think I don't know if you're comfortable with me saying this more publicly. Don't worry, I'm not going to get in trouble. But I think you've been a wonderful source of support. I starting from when I was a student to now, I cannot tell you how many times I came into a difficult situation and began to care for someone near me and found out that you were there with them. So I think that models the role that you take for students and a kind of facet of your professorial or your ministry on campus being pastoral care. Could you say a little bit about what it means for you to be a professor who offers pastoral care for your students?
Yeah, thanks, Madison. I appreciate that. And that is a part of my sense of God's call in my life. As pastor, I loved preaching and teaching and wanted to be theological, but I love the people. And it's interesting. I'm kind of an introvert by personality, and so not everybody thinks of me as that people person. But that's very, very true. I love the pastoral care. One of the things I miss most about being a vocational pastor are funerals, if you can believe that. Just an opportunity to minister to people at a time of great need. But now as a professor, obviously I care about my courses. I care about teaching. I want to mentor in a whole host of ways, but I also want to care for people. Part of that is advocacy for our women students, advocacy for students of color, for students dealing with sexuality issues. And part of it is caring. In this pandemic, it's been so hard. So whether it's people in our formation group, people in classes, I do try to reach out. I try to be a welcoming presence, someone that people can feel free to talk to. And I'm just grateful for those opportunities. I think it's so important. We teach our students, we train our students, we mentor students. Well, we should, but we need to care for each other too.
Amen. Thank you for the ways that you've served our community.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a great privilege.
That's great, Steve. And I've appreciated a number of these issues you've brought up that are, sort of pressing issues you've seen as maybe being neglected at times in the course of the church's maybe recent history or what have you. And I'm just kind of curious, as you kind of been working, at TEDS for a number of years, working in ministry for a number of years, what are currently pressing issues, or maybe even kind of futurely pressing issues that you feel the evangelical church or other churches need to be really focused in on in terms of moving forward in ministry going into the next few years or even decades, if you could forecast that far?
Oh boy, there's a lot. I would say that much of the cutting edge of my own reflection, my teaching, speaking, different kinds of things, working with students has been in some of these intersection points between Christian faith and ministry and pressing contemporary needs. In the environment that we're in, the world of politics is obviously huge. And I'm grieved at the way so many in the church have found themselves seduced by this idol of political power. And will want to gravitate to that, and we need another sense of it's not that politics and political power is a bad thing. Paul says in Romans 13 that government rulers are God's servants for your good. There is much good that can be done, but it can be this idol. And we've seen so many times, think January 6th and the role that Christian nationalism plays and Christian symbols in an attempt to grab power. And I think much in the white evangelical church especially has dealt with that. I think there's another cluster of issues involving gender that is huge. Probably one of the biggest shifts in my own theological perspective over many years in ministry has been on women in ministry questions. When I was in the early years of my Christian life, I was raised in strongly complementarian environments, and that was the sort of teaching. And it was through some ministry experience, through the impact of my wife and our two daughters. We have three kids, a son and two daughters, through women students at Trinity, that I needed to go back and re-look at what the Bible actually said. And I have shifted to be a very strong egalitarian. And I think that impacts the church in society, the nature of the church. For the past 15 years, my wife and I have been members of LaSalle Street Church. And one of the great highlights of that is having a female senior pastor who's a marvelous preacher and a great leader. And I've learned so much. I so appreciate that. One of the things, though, that I think a contemporary issue that I have done quite a bit of work on has to do with the crisis in the church of sexual abuse. And I've thought a lot about some of the elements of a church culture that creates an environment where sexual abuse can occur and be covered up and that sort of thing. And two of the key issues involve power differentials that can exist either through clericalism or through patriarchy. And so I teach about that to all of our pastoral students and required pastoral practice classes. And we've got to come to a handle with that. There have been far too many cases of whether it be moral failures themselves, but then abusive kinds of relationships. Race is a huge issue. Oh my goodness. One of the things that, again, our church, LaSalle Street Church, which is an interracial church, we're part of a book discussion group that has of recent been focusing on issues of race. We're reading Howard Thurman's book. I don't know if you're familiar with him, Jesus and the Disinherited. This is blowing my mind in terms of opening my eyes to the nature of the privilege that I have, the stories of African American brothers and sisters, the kinds of discussions that we're able to have. That's a growth area for the church, for me personally, for our family. So I think that, along with the one of the things, if I can just take a minute more, in August of 2019, so pretty, one of the last summers before the pandemic hit, I taught a course in Seoul, Korea, as a part of our Korea D-Min program. And the course was designed in consultation with our Korean partners, but they wanted a course on ecclesiology, and we settled on a framework. It was a 4-day intensive, and we had 2 days on some fundamental ecclesiological truths about the nature of the church, the leadership in the church. And then we looked at issues, and I highlighted 3: the church and politics, sexual abuse, and success and failure. And it was interesting to see in a Korean context, every bit as much issues as in an American context. Unfortunately, they're the sort of things that we have to do. But those, and the link between the nature of the church, ecclesiology, and some of these critical issues for the church today.
Wow, thanks, Steve. I mean, those are those are big issues. To imagine that all of those are the ones that are facing us in the present and the future as well is a bit daunting. So I suppose I'm glad we're not doing it all on our own. We've got the power of Christ with us and inside of us. If we could just kind of follow up briefly on one point you made there, and I'm wondering, kind of making a little bit of a connection. So on the issue of like Christians in politics and political power and sort of the grab for power, and maybe bringing it back to the issue of like success. Do you see sort of like a skewed understanding of what success is when it comes to political power and authority within the political sphere that Christians are trying to are getting skewed by their conceptions of success in?
Yeah, that's a really helpful connection. Thanks for making that. I do think if we define success by sort of bottom lines and say in a political world it's winning elections or holding power, then that opens a door for anything goes that can help me to achieve that. So the power becomes the end, the goal, rather than saying, how can I be faithful to both what God has called me to do in this world of the political realm and how to do it with respect, how to do it fairly, those kind of things. I think if our definition of success is skewed in terms of this bottom line approach, it becomes all too easy to say the end justifies any of the means. And I think, unfortunately, we've had far too much experience with that in recent history to know the horrible costs that can come from that.
Yeah.
Great. Thanks.
Thank
Thanks for that
Steve.
connection.
Yeah.
Well, we're about to have to wrap, although I feel like I personally could listen to you all day, Steve. I appreciate your reflections, and it's always good to learn from you. You were my first preaching professor ever, but certainly my first at TEDS, and it was a good experience, so thank you.
Wow.
On that note, we have recently, of course, we've recently learned that you will be retiring at the end of 2021. So congratulations, first of all.
Well, thank you.
But
thank you.
We'd love to hear what you have on the horizon, and maybe some of your hope for TEDS as you transition from full-time service.
Okay. Well, thank you. And I've heard from many colleagues like yourselves and very kind words. And oftentimes the question that is asked is, so what have you got on the horizon? And some have asked, are you going to stay in the area? And the answer is yes. 2 of our 3 children live here, 4 of our 7 grandchildren. And so we are, although Susan and I are looking forward to a little freedom in some of those winter months. Our 3rd child lives in Southern California, and that sounds pretty good, about January, February or so. It's been a little time there. But, plans. And of course, only the Lord knows all the things that he might bring in. But beyond, sleep and some decompression, I just want to enjoy, my plans are to enjoy my marriage to Susan. That is a critical part of my vocation. I've learned a lot from Roman Catholic thoughts about vocation, where marriage is a vocation. And I want to grow in that, continue the work we're doing to strengthen a joyful marriage. I want to be a good dad and grandpa. But one of the goals that I have is to try and explore more of some of the parts of my own relationship with the Lord that I've found it personally kind of difficult in an academic environment. Things like contemplative prayer. I think that TEDs were committed to the life of the mind, and well, we should be. But we sometimes, I think, forget, or at least I can forget, that Jesus' command to love God with our whole being includes, there are 4 things he says, and only one of them is cognitive, and some of these other aspects, heart, soul, mind, strength. I want to grow in some of those areas. And I told one of my faculty colleagues that there may even be a kayak in my future. So we're excited about those kind of things this next season in our life, and thankful for our time at TEDS, and I'm sure that we'll continue to have connections along the way. But it's the right time for us to make this move.
That's wonderful, Steve. And I've got a kayak, so that'll have to be an activity that we can where we can see each other again. I'll be looking forward to it.
Okay, very good. Yes. That's great.
Well, that's just the foreword. We hope that you'll check out Dr. Roy's book, What God Thinks When We Fail, published by InterVarsity Press, and various other resources that Dr. Roy has produced for us. We thank him so much for his service to TEDS and his continued service to the church. Although Dr. Roy will no longer be teaching here at TEDS full-time, he leaves a rich legacy, especially in our Pastoral Theology department. So we hope you'll consider joining us and benefiting from all of this wonderful work. So with that, I'd like to thank our charming producer, Curtis Pierce, our fierce and fantastic graduate assistant, Lauren Janusik, and you, our listeners. Thank you. I'm Madison Pierce.
And I'm James Arcadi.
Thanks, Steve.
Thank you. It's been great.
Forward is a podcast hosted by faculty at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. The views expressed by the hosts and guests of Forward do not necessarily represent the views of Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. You can subscribe to our newest episode on your preferred podcast app or at forwardpodcast.com. Be sure to follow us on Twitter and Facebook at Forward Podcast to get updates and additional links to content. Trinity Evangelical Divinity School is located 25 miles north of Chicago with extension sites across the country and online. Trinity educates men and women to engage in God's redemptive work in the world by cultivating academic excellence, Christian faithfulness, and lifelong learning. You can find more information at teds.edu.